Mr. President.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. President, I rise to make a contribution on this motion on behalf of the Labor opposition and the Labor Party more broadly in the community, which the Honourable John Richard Johnson served all of his life. I first met Mr. Johnson in this building, in the chambers of the Office of the President, sometime during 1987. I was then a research officer for a backbench member of the other place, the Legislative Assembly, and I had been charged with the responsibility of planning and conducting a fundraising event. But before I was allowed to embark upon, in my own time of course, but before I was permitted to embark on such a weighty undertaking, I was sent to see the President of the Legislative Council, who was very well known for his skills and attributes in this area, to get some advice. And he very graciously gave me some of his time, and in his office I outlined what I thought was a pretty good plan. He listened very politely, looking at me over through his spectacles, and then at the end he looked at me and said, "Son, have you considered running a raffle instead?" Now, I wasn't sure if this was a reflection on what I thought was my cunning plan, or perhaps more a reflection on the legendary raffles that Mr. Johnson was known to run for the Labor Party more generally. But I was but one of many people of my generation, former generations and those to come, who sought advice from Mr. Johnson on a range of matters, because he was regarded correctly as a great tribal elder in the Australian Labor Party. In many countries, royalty confers honours on those citizens who are regarded as outstanding. Knighthoods even. Not in this country, Mr. President, but in other countries. Much more rarely, so does a pope. Johno Johnson has been honoured by 2 popes, the latest by Pope Francis. 2 years ago, Johno received the highest civilian papal award, the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St Gregory the Great. And while he was perfectly entitled to use that honorific, he would never have called himself Sir Johno. He was a widely respected politician, not only on our side but across the Parliament, and former trade union leader, and that's very important because he never forgot that he came from the wider social movement of the trade unions of New South Wales. He was also regarded and honoured for the three enduring passions of his life: his family, the Catholic Church and the Australian Labor Party. A month before Christmas in 1976, not long after he'd been elected to the Legislative Council, he made a few important remarks in the Parliament. He spoke of values, about the political crisis that lingered even after President Nixon had resigned, Watergate, and about how in its aftermath several countries were endeavouring to tackle the issue of election campaign donations. This was 1976. In some respects, not a lot has changed. But New South Wales was then facing a brighter future. Neville Wran had just been elected Premier. And the society that he spoke to was in many respects a very different one to the one in which we all live today. He ended that speech on a personal note, saying, and I quote, "Mr. President and honourable members, I trust that my sojourn in this House will not at any future time be looked back upon in anger by anyone," unquote. It wasn't but long before, on Melbourne Cup Day 1978, that Johno Johnson was elected as the youngest ever president of this place, the Legislative Council of New South Wales, the first parliamentary chamber in Australia. And he thrived in that role for many years, enjoying the support even of the crossbench parties, at least for a considerable period of time. He abandoned the use of ceremonial attire, preferring to preside in a suit without wig or gown. And during his presidency, the new Parliament House buildings were constructed and the original buildings restored. Again, Mr. President, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This wasn't a man who set out just to be liked. His convictions about social justice and many things were immense. particularly social justice. And Johno Johnson was a worker at every level. And when he was first honoured by a Pope in 2006, former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was among his guests at the ceremony. Nearly a full decade later, at the full knighthood ceremony in Woollahra's Wulp Jewish Hospital, his guests on that day included former Prime Minister Paul Keating and former Premiers Bob Carr and Barry Unsworth. That was the mark of the man. Mr Keating made the point that Johno had been a mentor to many, and it was also the standard by which you measure fidelity to the Labor cause. Even his opponents, and there were some, gave him credit for being a conscientious person in both a secular and in a spiritual sense. Mr Carr recalled how in his earliest political days no task was too small for Johno Johnson. Johno had sustained and encouraged him when he was building his political career, as he did for so many. And he was always ready to come in, roll his sleeves up and get to work himself. No task was too menial. He was never too grand to do the work that needed to be done. Either on polling days when he'd get a leg of lamb, a loaf of bread, tomatoes and mustard, and set about feeding the army of volunteers, or running the canteen, the tea room and the pie shop at the Sydney Town Hall at innumerable state Labor Party conferences. Who can forget the International Roast Caterers Blend beverages over so many decades? I acknowledge those interjections. Indeed, he was top shelf. Johno Johnson was born at Murwillumbah in 1930, leaving school at 15 to become a grocer, work in the railway industry, manage a credit union and become a trade union official before entering politics and Parliament. He married the greatest love of his life, Pauline Russell, in 1962. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters, and I acknowledge the family with us here today in the chamber. Mr Johnson was first elected to the Legislative Council in November 1975, taking his seat in April 1976. And in his maiden speech in November 1976, he spoke out against abortion and for government-funded election campaigns. He was a product of a very different age, where differences were acceptable and cooperation in politics was often possible. And I hope that those possibilities are not lost even in today's world. He had a commitment to justice throughout his business and political life. He served as the director of the Prince of Wales Hospital and a board member for both New South Wales Lotteries and the Cancer Council of Australia, as well as long and distinguished service as chairman of the board of the Catholic Press print newspaper company, publisher The Catholic Weekly, helping to restore it to profitability, without ever easing up on his work for a variety of Catholic charities, living the principles which won him respect, as well as some opposition. So in remembering him today, we are glad that he was given the gift of time, and for a long time, those who knew him best will mourn his passing. May his God bless Johno Johnson and grant him eternal peace.